Hey there, welcome to another episode of Fast Talk, your source for the science of endurance performance. Today, it's a fast chat conversation in which we discuss two studies that are questioning the science of Zone 2 training. While elite endurance athletes have known about it for a long time, Zone 2 training has taken the entire endurance sports world by storm in the last decade. And it hasn't stopped there. Now, popular social media influencers and podcasters are promoting it as the best path to health for the general population. There are many ways to define Zone 2. In simple terms, it's training just below our first lactate threshold. Think of it as a slightly uncomfortable pace or wattage that can be held for hours. Top researchers, such as Dr. Paul Larson and Dr. John Hawley, have published detailed papers explaining how Zone 2 training benefits us and increases our mitochondrial density by promoting a critical messenger called PGC1 alpha. Their detailed explanations had long been considered the accepted science. That is, until a review published in June 2025 entitled Much Ado About Zone 2 said, hold that thought. This particular review focused on whether Zone 2 training was beneficial for the general population. The conclusion was that for people looking to train a few hours per week for health benefits, high intensity still provides much more bang for their buck. But the review didn't stop there. It went further to challenge the previously accepted science. It was established that Zone 2 training triggers PGC1 alpha through the calcium calmodulin pathway and high intensity through the AMP-ATP pathway. The review looked at the literature on both and ultimately concluded that we may have it wrong, even in trained athletes. They found high-intensity work seemed to act on both pathways, while Zone 2 training may have minimal impact on either. As part of their evidence, the Much Ado review cited a 2022 paper multiple times, that one entitled Impact of Altered Exercise, Volume, Intensity, and Duration on the Activation of AMPK and calcium MK2 and Increases in PGC1 alpha mRNA. This second paper also looked at the effects of Zone 2 training and high-intensity training on these two critical pathways. However, it came to a different conclusion, stating that we don't have enough research on Zone 2 training to draw conclusions, and even cautioned against overinflating the importance of high-intensity training. This was a different conclusion from the 2025 paper, which is fascinating as both papers share an author. So, in this Fast Chat episode, we'll give our assessments of both papers, explaining where we agree and where we have issues. But perhaps the most important message we'll discuss is that we always have to remember that no science is ever fully resolved. It is always more complex than we think, and it is important to never take even a good idea and apply it to everything and everyone. So, get ready to decide if you want to go hard or if you want to go easy. Let's make you fast. Trevor, you're looking so very happy today. Giddy. You've just read some studies that blew your mind in a way. They're biochemistry, so look at you. You can't stop smiling.
You're a kid in a candy store.
I am just in such a good mood right now.
But you can't be too long-winded today. It's complicated. It's complex science, but
I am well aware of the fact that on this episode, you're going to be telling me to shut up a lot.
Excellent.
And
politely.
you have my full permission. Chris is not going to do it politely. Griffin, you might be more polite.
I'll try.
But I'm going to be told to shut up a lot in this episode.
Very good.
I will say, though, this is a what we are thinking about episode.
Mm-hmm.
I am really thinking about this.
Well, let's dive into what you're thinking about. So Zone 2 has been everywhere lately. And when I say lately, it really has never gone away in conversation. But recently, there have been some podcast interviews on Zone 2. And you've mentioned, Trevor, even seeing this wave of interviews and coverage, especially in this past year. So I'm curious with this first paper, why this paper and why did you choose to tackle it now?
So this paper just came out in June of 2025, and it has been getting a lot of traction, a lot of interest. It's been getting a lot of debate as well out on social media. The short title is Much Ado About Zone 2, which is kind of a fun title.
Mm-hmm.
Continuing a narrative review assessing the efficacy of Zone 2 training for improving mitochondrial capacity and cardiorespiratory fitness in the general population.
Sorry. Yes, continue.
I'm just reading titles and I'm already
He's just
killing
so
Chris.
excited.
So the short of it is Zone 2 has become really popular. It got popularized with endurance athletes. Somebody will probably argue with me on this, but I really see Dr. Sam Milan as the one who defined this and really pushed this and showed benefits with this. And what you are seeing now is it has gotten out into the public, and they even talk at the start of this paper about influencers have jumped on board this. And now there's this feeling that Zone 2 is the way to health, the way to fitness. We should be doing a ton of Zone 2. I know Dr. Peter Attia has talked a lot about it. Mm-hmm. And this paper is basically saying, hold up, wait a second.
Yeah.
Is it really the best way to health? Is it really the best way to fitness? Is it right to be telling people you should just be doing Zone 2 all the time?
Mm-hmm.
So many questions in one, though. There's so many different audiences or populations you're talking about who have different metabolic needs and therapeutic interventions depending on the goal.
Right.
Yep.
So right away, I think you talked about this earlier when you're preparing for this episode. Who is the population they talk about at the beginning, and how does that change partway through the paper?
So they say it right in the title. They're talking about the general population. This study was done up in Canada, and the lead author is Kristi Storoshuk.
I think that's a decent pronunciation. Yeah, we'll go with that.
I'm sure somebody out there just cringed at that pronunciation, but that's what we'll go with. I actually heard her on Dr. Larson's podcast, and it was a great episode. I sent him an email right afterwards and said, I really enjoyed that, where they had this conversation about have we gone too far with Zone 2. And she gave a lot of her background, which was really interesting. So I'd recommend if anybody finds this interesting, we're doing a short conversation, go check out that podcast.
Yeah.
So the paper really starts focusing on sedentary, unfit populations. And that's who they're really trying to talk to. Though I did find it interesting through the paper, they really just kind of move away from that population and just talk in general about, are there benefits to Zone 2 training? So the focus here is on our mitochondria, because we know that mitochondria density, mitochondrial health is important both to our general health and to our aerobic fitness. So they really just go into this, does Zone 2 training really help mitochondrial biogenesis?
Yeah, we've talked about this. Terminology and definitions are so important in both of these papers. So when we talk about sedentary and unfit, we're really talking about those who are metabolically impaired. So in case you're just thinking fit versus athlete or not, it's those who are metabolically impaired.
Yep. And look, I will tell you, part of the reason I'm really smiling, I want to take a quick step back before we dive into either of these two papers we're going to talk about today. They really showed something that I love, or two things that I love. One is, and forgive me, I'm going to quote Dr. Seiler for this. I remember seeing Dr. Seiler at a big conference presentation where everybody at this round table were asked a question and everybody was trying to find an answer to it. And they got to Dr. Seiler, and his answer was, we have to be humble and recognize there's more about physiology that we don't know than we do know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think both of these papers really emphasize that, because big names in exercise physiology have written very detailed papers on the two pathways we're about to talk about. And we've really kind of accepted, here's the way it works. And these two papers are going, no, what we've accepted for 10 years, it's more complex than that. And we don't fully understand. So I love that about both of these papers. But the other thing that these papers raise is you have to be so careful about the details you use, because depending on how you look at the details, you can draw very different conclusions. And as we dive into this paper, this is going to be my one criticism. I think they got some of the details wrong and didn't recognize that. And ultimately, they have a criticism of what's happening right now, but fall into the same trap.
Mm.
And one of the first details is right in the name of the paper. It's how they define Zone 2, right?
Right.
So
Yes.
What's the difference that you've seen here versus what you might have seen in other literature or even from an exercise physiologist?
So at the top of the paper, they do define Zone 2 correctly, which is typically defined as exercise below LT1. It's right below LT1.
Yeah.
As I said, Zone 2, there is a Zone 1 below that. And as they go through the paper, they lose that distinction. And they multiple times talk about the percentages of VO2 max that they would define as Zone 2. And I would love for somebody to counter me on this, but I don't agree at all with their definition.
Yeah.
At one point late in the paper, they defined zone 2 as below 45% of VO2 max. That's not even walking pace.
Mm-hmm.
I looked at that in terms of heart rate and other metrics, did the calculations, and I'm like, yeah, if I went out for a walk, I would be above this. Now, they are talking about sedentary populations, and yes, zone 2 is going to be lower in a sedentary population. But I did look into this, what's the common definition? And even in a sedentary population, it's highly individual, but they're generally going to put zone 2 closer to 65%.
Right.
And in a trained population, they're going to put it as high as 80%.
Mm-hmm.
And they do multiple times in the paper talk about research that was at 60% of VO2 max, and they state that's above zone 2. And I fully disagree with them on that. And that's important because there are points when they reference studies where training was done at 65, 70% of VO2 max, and they actually call that high-intensity training
Right.
and show benefits of that and use that as an argument for why high-intensity training is far better than zone 2, where I would look at it and go, yeah, no, that's zone 2 training.
Yeah, right.
Okay, since we're diving into the paper spends a lot of time on AMPK and PGC1 alpha. Can we break down for the listeners what those molecules do and why they're considered so central to mitochondrial biogenesis?
Oh boy.
Okay, let's see if I can do this in not half an hour. So
You got 2 minutes.
I'm going to give a very simple explanation. And look, I know Dr. Larson listens to our show every once in a while, so I cringe whenever I simplify these things because I know somewhere he and other people are listening to this and going, oh, Trevor, come on, it's not that simple.
All of this is not that simple. That's kind of one of the points we're trying to make.
Which is a good point.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give a very simplified explanation, but there's a couple things you need to know about. So when you are talking about mitochondrial biogenesis, so seeing adaptations in your mitochondria, there are multiple pathways that promote that. Ultimately, they all impact something we talk a lot about on the show, PGC1 alpha.
Mm-hmm.
It is considered the master regulator of mitochondrial biogenesis, and even that's a simplification. There are other ways, but we're mostly focused on PGC1 alpha. And what has been identified, and for anybody who's interested, we did an episode, it was number 271 on the work of Dr. John Hawley. We talk about a paper that he wrote where he talks about the 4 things that promote PGC1 alpha. Both of these papers focus on 2 of them, which is what most of the exercise physiology research focuses on.
Mm-hmm.
One pathway is this AMPK pathway. So I'm going to try to explain this as simple as possible, but all pathways, there's multiple steps.
It's a cascade.
It is a cascade. So what you have happen is in the muscle cells, you see an increase in AMP ADP. That then triggers something called AMPK. AMPK is then one of the regulators of PGC1 alpha. So when AMPK senses higher AMP, higher ADP, it says, okay, need to do something.
Mm-hmm.
And then it goes and promotes PGC1 alpha. And you see an increase in PGC1 alpha in the cell. Very simplified, but did that make sense?
Yes, of course.
You're crushing it.
So that's your cascade. There's another cascade.
Ooh,
in
double
cells,
cascade.
you constantly see a release of calcium into the cytosol.
Calcium ions.
Calcium ions. You will see often after exercise, calcium remain elevated. When that gets elevated, so this is the calcium comodulin pathway, you see something called CaMKII get activated. And same thing as with AMPK, CaMKII, they both have that K in it, they're kinases.
Yep.
CaMKII then goes and promotes PGC1 alpha. So what we're trying to look at in the research is both what causes these cascades and also do you see an effect all the way down the pathway ultimately to PGC1 alpha, mitochondrial biogenesis. The belief, what's been written about a bunch, is ultimately the AMPK, I'll just simplify it to that pathway, is promoted by high intensity work.
Mm-hmm.
And this calcium comodulin or the CaMKII is promoted by long, slow endurance training. And that's where zone 2 comes in.
Right.
And what we've said a bunch of times on the show is they're additive. So you need the intensity, you need the long, slow, you need to activate both pathways, and that's where you're going to see the most benefits. And basically what both of these papers do is say, yeah, not that simple.
Right. But do they also make the mistake of going too far and saying something that is a bit counter to kind of the message they were trying to attempt to say?
I would say personally, and this is where you're getting my opinion, and we'll dive into this and I'll give you my explanations why, the Zone 2 paper goes too far. Well, I fully support the main message they're trying to convey. I think they made some big mistakes. You point out something really interesting, which is the Zone 2 paper, the final author is the lead author on the other paper.
Right.
But interestingly, the papers say very different things. And the second paper, which I found reading the Zone 2 paper, I actually have no issues with it, but I find it actually counters the Zone 2 paper. So it's very interesting that you have a lead author who's on both of those papers, and would love to talk with that lead author and go, your first paper kind of contradicts the Zone 2 paper. So what happened?
I would have thought there would have been an acknowledgement of that. If I had been on both papers and I'd been the lead on the other, I would have wanted that to be acknowledged.
Yep.
Athletica is trusted by endurance athletes and coaches around the world for one reason: it works. Built on the foundations of sports science, our adaptive AI platform supports your training not with hype, but with real evidence. Go try it yourself at athletica.ai and use the code FASTTALK to get 15% off a 6-month subscription. And for coaching businesses or platforms interested in AI-powered training under their own brand, we'd love to talk.
Do you want to go into a little bit more detail about what this contradiction is and how it comes to be in these two papers?
Oh, you know I want to go.
I know. That is the question.
Well, let's start with the Zone 2 paper. Again, fully agree with their message. What they say from the outset is Zone 2 has become incredibly popularized. And now people are being told, just do Zone 2, particularly sedentary populations who are only training 3-4 hours a week. And you're going to see the most metabolic health gains. And they're saying, this is too far. The evidence isn't there.
Right. And we would agree with that.
I'm not going to argue with any of that. And I will even go as far as to say, I agree. When somebody is training 3-4 hours a week and they are doing this for health, there's a lot of evidence that you are going to see better gains from doing more intensity. So I'm not going to argue with it. As a matter of fact, we cited a paper or talked about a paper a couple episodes ago that looked at the impact of training on longevity and did show that you saw better improvement in the markers of longevity from high intensity than you did from long, slow endurance. And I said, if I was a betting man, I would have lost that bet because I would have said otherwise.
Yeah.
That paper wasn't looking at endurance athletes. It was comparing endurance athletes to strength athletes. So that surprised me a little bit. So yeah, I'm not going to argue with that point at all. What I have personal issues with, and I don't want to sound too argumentative, when I listened to the lead author on Dr. Larson's show, she kind of took it a step further and started saying, show me gains of Zone 2. I just don't see the gains of it. And they very clearly in this paper try very clearly to make the argument that actually high intensity promotes both the AMPK and the calcium commodulin pathway. And there is no evidence that Zone 2 really promotes either. Again, it's nuanced. They do talk about, yes, Zone 2 seems to help fatty acid oxidation. So you're going to use more fat for fuel from Zone 2 training. But the rest of it, they really said, yeah, you see more benefit from high intensity. And I did hear her on Dr. Larson's show really kind of pushing on the why bother doing Zone 2?
I think what's important is even taking a step back, and Chris, you've been reporting on endurance sports for a while, and why that conversation seems very peculiar, or why that statement seems so peculiar now in 2025.
Yeah. Well, this gets into sort of and I know Trevor's going to talk more about this, the lack of evidence. It should not lead you to conclude that it doesn't have a basis. But it also is, if you've ever trained for an event, if you are an athlete that does bike races, running races, whatever, triathlons, you know that it's the combination that you need to get to your best performances. You can't just put everything in one bucket or the other bucket. And she's sort of suggesting, why would anybody do Zone 2? And that is a confounding statement in a way.
And look, I'll give them credit. They keep some of the nuance. But yeah, that is the overall message, is they are starting by saying, We've gone too far towards zone 2. Everybody's promoting just zone 2 all the time. That's a mistake. We need high intensity. 100% agree. But then if you read the paper and listen to some of the interviews, they kind of go to the opposite end of why would you bother doing zone 2? And this is where I really struggle with the paper, because in their conclusions, they literally make this statement. Again, this is going back to you got to be really careful about what you state in research, because they make a statement that is a very strong statement and then literally contradict themselves in the rest of their conclusions. So the statement they say up at the front, further, the majority of the available evidence argues against the ability of zone 2 training to increase mitochondrial capacity. I can't back that statement from their study.
Yeah.
Because they're basically saying the evidence is against zone 2. That is different from saying the research hasn't been done on zone 2.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So they make that statement. Then in the rest of the conclusion say, many gaps remain in our understanding of whether and how mitochondria adapt to zone 2 training. Then a major finding of the current review is that few studies have explicitly examined the effect of zone 2 training. So they start by saying the bulk of the evidence shows no benefits to zone 2. And then they go on and say, there's no research on zone 2.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those fundamentally contradict each other. And we'll get to this in the second paper. The second paper just says there's very little research on zone 2. We just don't know. And I think that is a completely fair statement that, yeah, we have made the assumption that zone 2 really hits this calcium comodulin pathway. And we don't have enough evidence to say, yeah, absolutely conclusive. We're not there. 100% agree with that. But I think this paper, drawing these conclusions, it just went too far to say, yep, you really see all the gains from high intensity and the evidence is against zone 2. I think that's where they got to, and they don't make their case.
Yeah.
I think they make some mistakes. One of them being that you can say the evidence isn't there, but you can't say that is proof that zone 2 is not beneficial.
Does this also open the door for criticism or definition about duration here? Because that's a substantial element to these studies.
So that's another one that you see in both papers. And I think the second paper actually does a better job of recognizing this, but duration is important. And the literature made this mistake 15, 20 years ago when they looked at intensity versus long, slow distance and really then pushed intensity. And when they were talking about long, slow distance, they were talking about short duration. And both of these papers, most of the research they cite on long duration is 90 minutes or less. As a matter of fact, multiple times they cite papers that people are training in zone 2 for 30 minutes. And again, if you're talking about a sedentary population, 90 minutes might be considered long. But even when I'm working with brand new athletes and we're saying we're going to build your aerobic fitness, I would still say 90 minutes is the minimum.
Right.
I'm not going to have them do a 6-hour ride, but 2, 2.5, 3.
Yeah.
So that's important. There are many times in the paper where they go, we see no benefits of zone 2, and then you dive into the study that they're citing, and it's 30 minutes or 45 minutes at 60%. And you go, that's a recovery ride. But it's important to point out that we have been just talking about this 2025 paper that looks at the potential benefits or the lack of benefits of zone 2 training in a general population. But this is where it gets interesting. So there's that other paper, and its title is a mouthful, so maybe we'll just refer to it as the 2022 paper. So it was written a few years earlier.
Read it.
Are you going to make me do this?
And then-
We'll forget the whole question by the time I'm done.
With the same
It's not
enthusiasm.
that long, actually.
Impacts of altered exercise volume, intensity, and duration on the activation of AMPK and CaMKII and increases in PGC1 alpha mRNA. So they're talking about these pathways as well. One thing I am going to mention, you heard that in the title, volume, intensity, and duration. This got confusing. I've never seen this done before. Duration is what they are using to describe when you do a long workout. Volume, to the best of my ability, that's what we would be referring to as work or training stress. So they see volume as a function of intensity and duration.
I see. Okay.
So intensity can contribute to volume, duration can contribute to volume. So I would call that training stress.
Right, or
Or
workload.
workload.
Yeah.
And it gets confusing as you read it because I keep seeing volume and duration and go, okay, which one's which
right.
again?
That is confusing. Okay.
But here's where it gets interesting because I found this paper reading the Zone 2 paper. It was referenced at several key points. It was referenced when they made their argument that intensity is better than Zone 2 at producing mitochondrial benefits. And this was their reference. It was also their only reference when they made the case that intensity can promote both the AMPK pathway and the calcium commodulin pathway. So I was like, got to grab this paper. It seems central. And what I found really surprising is when you read that paper, it is in many ways the best argument against what it's being cited for. So these are quotes right out of that 2022 paper. The first one, this is in their introduction and basically the warning they give in the introduction. We will attempt to highlight the studies that have isolated the effect of exercise intensity by matching total training volume, and we'll discuss the complications of interpreting studies where both intensity and volume are augmented as evidence supporting the superiority of intensity for activating mitochondrial biogenesis. So they're kind of warning about saying intensity is superior. Again, it was the only paper cited as their evidence that intensity promotes the calcium commodulin pathway. Direct quote out of the paper. The bulk of the literature does not support an intensity-dependent activation of CaMKII. And then finally, in their conclusions, again, this is a paper cited to say intensity is better than duration or volume or Zone 2. This is their conclusions. We are unfortunately unable to comment with certainty regarding which of intensity or duration are the better means of augmenting volume, so training stress, when targeting optimal increases in exercise-mediated mitochondrial biogenesis. So their conclusion is we can't say which is better.
I think this is one of the reasons why I struggle with the first paper. I just didn't feel like the methods were solid, not just from defining the terms, but the conclusion is propped up on a fallacy, plain and simple.
It's interesting. So
It is. That's a logical fallacy.
yeah. So I would love the author that's on both papers to go and talk with him and say, why are you citing your own paper to make a case that in that paper you say you can't make? You actually argue against.
You seem to like this second paper more in the message being it's complicated. Some of the accepted beliefs or simplification of pathways are a little bit too simplified, if you will. And this goes into more of the nuance of that.
Yeah. I love this paper. I have no issues with this paper. I love ones that get into the complexity. And it is basically a response to a pretty widely held and accepted belief. And I am one of those people that fully accepted this belief that long, slow volume Zone 2 training acts through this calcium commodulin pathway. High intensity acts through the AMPK pathway, and that they're additive. And this paper said, hold on, let's see if there's actually any research to support this.
Yeah. And not to defend anybody, but we're talking about what we've already described as extremely complicated physiology. Someone like Dr. Seiler, who is steeped in this stuff on a daily basis, is saying we don't know as much as we think we know. There's so much more to learn. Sometimes we have to simplify things so that we can have a conversation about this stuff. Sometimes you have to simplify things in order to make it digestible for lay people out there who aren't biochemists. However, sometimes you can go too far.
You can. And I think this paper was a really good
reminder
for those of you who are steeped in this. Be careful about what you say. And I don't think it made some of the mistakes that I saw in the first paper. They actually talk in here about one of the major issues is we have almost no research on Zone 2 training on long duration. And they don't say, so that is evidence that it doesn't work.
Yeah.
They are saying basically we can't draw conclusions. More importantly, and I would love it if this is where we finish out, because again, I think this is the ultimate mistake of the first paper. They give the warning of be careful about overinflating high intensity because there is a ton of research on high intensity.
Yeah, there's a bias towards it because it's easier to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Hi, listeners. This is Susie Sanchez from USA Cycling. For over a decade, Fast Talk Podcast has brought the most interesting experts from the world of endurance sports into a conversation about your training. If you like what you hear on Fast Talk, what about becoming a certified coach? USA Cycling offers courses for new coaches produced with expert help from Fast Talk Labs. Learn about becoming a certified coach at usacycling.org/coaches.
Basically, without diving hugely into the details of this paper, they take those two pathways that we just talked about, and they go through the AMPK pathway. So first, what impact do you see on AMP, ADP, then on AMPK, and then ultimately on PGC1 alpha and mitochondrial biogenesis? They do the same thing with the calcium calmodulin pathway. And then they look at both the impacts of intensity and duration. And quite frequently, they just go, there's no research on duration in this. And they recognize this, go, a lot of the research on duration is actually pretty short. And when they get to that AMPK pathway, they go, when you talk about duration, it actually gets extraordinarily complex. And I'll give you the very shortened version of this, which I'm glad to see somebody bring up. AMPK is referred to as the energy sensor in our cells. It detects glucose levels in our blood, and then it activates when glucose levels drop. It is also, we do know it is activated by high intensity because when you see AMP levels go up, which you see when you do high intensity, that also activates AMPK. Mm-hmm. But if you're doing a lot of either hard training, or if you're doing really hard training, or you're doing a lot of volume, you deplete your glycogen. When you deplete your glycogen, your blood glucose levels will go down, and that also activates AMPK. So there is a potential for long duration to impact AMPK, but when you're only doing a 90-minute study at 60%, you're not going to deplete your glycogen.
Right.
If you're a pro going out and doing 5 hours at 280 watts, you're going to see some glycogen depletion. You might see AMPK be activated, but that research hasn't been done. Mm-hmm. So they're recognizing all this complexity. And I could go into each, but basically where they get to in the conclusions is that high intensity work has at least a small effect on the AMPK pathway, which is pretty consistent with what we've been saying and what we've been seeing in the past research. Mm-hmm. The second major point they make in their conclusion is there's very little research on duration. And again, to their credit, they say this is not evidence against, we just don't know. But they fairly say that we can't conclude that duration acts 100% through this calcium calmodulin pathway, like what we have accepted as dogma. There isn't enough research to back that either. And it's a really fair point. Mm-hmm. They don't have this in conclusions, but I do think they also make the point that it's not black and white. There's interesting evidence that intensity can potentially impact both pathways. Clearly impacts AMPK, but can have minor effects on the other pathway. Even on the AMPK pathway, there was some evidence that no, intensity doesn't affect it. And with the little bit of research on duration, there's potential for it to impact both pathways too. So it's not this black and white, one acts through this pathway, one acts through that pathway. And I think that's a really good point to make. Another thing they bring up early on is they're just looking at these two pathways, but there are two others that we know of impact PGC1 alpha.
There's so many layers here. That's how it gets even far more complicated.
And that's something I didn't bring up with the Zone 2 paper that I think is really important, where they make the case, well, we're not really seeing any benefits of Zone 2. Well, even if you're right, even if every one of their arguments is correct, they were only looking at mitochondrial biogenesis. And as I said, it was really Dr. Sam Milan who I think popularized Zone 2. He wasn't looking at mitochondria. He was looking at lactate metabolism. Mm-hmm. And that's not touched in either of these papers. Mm-hmm. And that is an important adaptation. So you can't just say, well, we don't see benefits to mitochondrial biogenesis, therefore Zone 2 is not beneficial. It could have other benefits that they're not even looking at. And again, this paper recognized that, said we're just looking at a couple things. There's a whole bunch that we're not touching on. Mm-hmm. And to actually just take this a step further, let's just talk about mitochondrial biogenesis. So forget all the lactate stuff. As we mentioned, and both papers did recognize this, there are 4 pathways to promoting mitochondrial biogenesis, to promoting that PGC1 alpha. These papers just talk about 2, the calcium calmodulin pathway and the AMPK pathway, and admit they don't address the other sides. One of the other really important ones is an increase in oxidative stress, can also promote mitochondrial biogenesis. And to give you an idea, We had Dr. Sam Milan on the show where we did an entire episode talking about Zone 2 training. This one goes back. This was episode 109 for anybody who's interested. And we spent a long time on that episode talking about oxidative stress and the fact that when you take elite, like Tour de France level cyclists, and you put them even through a huge stage race, you're actually going to see a decrease in their oxidative stress. Where if you take a far less experienced, far less trained cyclist and put them through less stress, the oxidative damage, the oxidative stress in their body will become overwhelming. So that's clearly an important adaptation. And remember, this 2025 paper is looking at mitochondrial biogenesis as a health benefit for the general population. And when you are talking about health benefits, when you're talking about longevity, one of the big theories of longevity is oxidative stress, that as we get older, our mitochondria doesn't function as well. And as a result, we start producing more oxidative stress, and that basically ages us. So there's a pretty good argument that if we can manage oxidative stress, if we can keep those natural antioxidants flowing in the body, if we can keep our mitochondria functioning well, we're going to age better and stave off disease. So when they have a paper about mitochondrial biogenesis and the impact of exercise training on that, and we know that oxidative stress promotes mitochondrial biogenesis and is also critical to health and longevity, and that's not even touched on in the paper, that to me is a really big hole in the paper. And another reason you can't conclude, well, there's no benefits to Zone 2. Because maybe that is where you see the benefits. Maybe that is where you see this general population producing this mitochondrial biogenesis through the oxidative stress pathway. We don't know because they didn't review that part and they didn't look at those studies. But again, going back to this 2022 paper, they conclude, and this is different from the 2025 paper, that we don't know if intensity or volume is better. So I love this paper that it basically says, this is complex. There's not enough research. We can't say it is clear-cut as we have been making it, and I'm fully guilty of saying it's clear-cut. Mm-hmm. And there just aren't that many conclusions we can draw, and we need to do more research on this. So I have zero issues with this review. I think it's a great review.
So while the first paper you say goes too far, this paper stops at the line that you're okay with?
Personally, yes.
Yes. Okay. So then what does the athlete do with this information?
Yeah, that's the question that I've been waiting, 30 minutes to ask. What?
There's not an ounce of sass in that question.
As a listener out there who just is riding his bike or running and training for an event, what do these papers mean for them?
Well, first of all, I think what's really important is because this Zone 2 paper has been getting so much press and has been really important, I think it's very important to understand what you can draw from this paper and what you can't. Mm-hmm. I agree 100% with the argument it's making that particularly in sedentary individuals, saying Zone 2 all the time is the way to go is a stretch too far. Mm-hmm. But I think we also have to be careful about what I heard in that podcast of going back the other way. And particularly because I am seeing an argument being made by this paper and the authors that was made 15, 20 years ago. That was a mistake because we didn't look at the shortcomings in the research, which was, again, there's a ton of research in high intensity. We see the benefits. There isn't really any research on true long duration Zone 2 training. Therefore, Zone 2 training isn't beneficial. High intensity is beneficial. So you should be doing high intensity all the time. The research community made that mistake 15, 20 years ago. And I'm seeing them literally cite the same studies from back then, making that same argument. You go, no, we realize that was a mistake then. Let's not make that mistake again. So you're probably hearing about this in social media. And I think, yep, their argument against doing Zone 2 all the time, spot on. Their argument that Zone 2 isn't beneficial and you should be doing all high intensity, just as big a mistake. Mm-hmm. I would say that is, to me, the biggest take home. And I would say, again, it's balance. It's a question of where is that balance? And I think, again, going back to Dr. Seiler, we got to be humble and say, there's a ton about physiology we don't understand. So yes, we have to rely on experience. And again, when I saw the interview with Dr. Larson, when he brought up experience, that was kind of, well, that doesn't count. Show me the research.
Mm-hmm.
And we just can't do that. We can't, as researchers, say, if it isn't in the research, it isn't real.
To that point, this is maybe a tough question to answer. If you're designing the next study based on what you want to know, what does that look like?
Both of these papers made that point really well, which is we've got to do the research on true zone 2 training with true duration.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the mistake, there's a lot of studies you can find circa 2005, 2010 that literally have in the titles, high intensity training is more effective than long, slow distance. And when you dive into the paper, they were matching for work. So they'd have them do 22 minutes of intervals and then a 40-minute ride at 60%, which is not a training ride.
Yeah.
So we need to do the research where we're going to have people go out, do 4, 5, 6 hours at a true zone 2. And if you're talking about a sedentary population, no, not 6 hours. Find a different duration. If you're talking about trained athletes, yeah, you need that longer duration, and it needs to be more than a 4-week study. It needs to be a long-term study. That's what I would love to see. Can that be funded? Can you conduct that study? It's really difficult, which is why it hasn't been done. But we're not going to have the answers until that is done.
And you demand those answers so that we can come back on here and you can get giddy all over again.
I'm going to go to some great business advice I was given when I started this business, which was be careful about waiting to make decisions until you have all the answers, because you will never have all the answers. You have to take the answers that you have, which is never perfect, and then make a decision and then adjust as you go. And this, to me, this zone 2 versus high intensity debate, we know where we're really lacking the research. I don't think we're going to have those answers anytime soon, and we can't wait to design training plans until we have those answers. So we got to take imperfect information and make the best decisions that we can. And that is why we can't put down experience.
It's interesting, like a researcher thinks that there's only one laboratory, but the coaches and athletes know that there's another laboratory. They're in it every day, and you can't discount that because they learn things and they might be ahead of the curve here at what works.
Either way, we want coaches and researchers to work together. And this is where you get coaches to stop talking to researchers when researchers get caught up in, well, experience doesn't count. It's only what's measured in a lab. And they go, here's what the research shows, and you need to be doing high intensity all the time. And the coach goes, I've been coaching athletes for 20 years. I've coached Olympic champions, Tour de France athletes.
Exactly.
That ain't the way it works. And the researcher goes, that's just experience. You're just talking out your butt.
Yeah.
That's when coaches go, yeah, I'm going to stop talking to you.
Yeah.
So there needs to be that conversation, and there needs to be the respect on both sides. So there's huge value to the research, but researchers need to have that bit of humility of saying, there's a ton that we can't research or that we just don't know. So we got to go with experience.
That was another episode of Fast Talk. The thoughts and opinions expressed on Fast Talk are those of the individual. Subscribe to Fast Talk wherever you prefer to find your favorite podcasts. Don't forget, we're now on YouTube. As always, be sure to leave us a rating and a review. To learn more about this episode, from show notes to references, visit us at fasttalklabs.com. And to join the conversation on our forum, go to forums.fasttalklabs.com. For Chris Case and Trevor Connor, I'm Dr. Griffin McMath. Thanks for listening.